I'm an autodidact, or more properly, the beneficiary of hundreds of hours of informal tutorials on all fields that interest me from some of the world's leading scientists. Daniel Dennett, American author, philosopher, and cognitive scientist. Welcome to another morning episode of the Liberty Dad podcast, a discussion on politics and culture. If you're tuning in live, I want to especially thank you for giving me your time so early. Now, as you can probably hear, my voice is a little off, and that's because I'm a little under the weather, but I think we're going to be able to make it, folks. I think we will manage. Um, so what do we got today? Well, recently I made a post and it was pretty brazen. You might even call it kind of on the arrogant side. So let me show you what's going on here. What did I do? And why do we need to have a conversation about it? So let's see here. Let's pull this up on the screen. So this fellow on Twitter made this comment, and I responded, and maybe I could have responded a little bit better, but I didn't. So here's what he said. So he made a post and he said, "My mom's address got leaked over this, but I do it again. I do it all again, and I meant what I said." Now this is the gentleman here. He's in college and he's presenting his paper, his research paper in I believe he's in a queer studies class, and it says white people are a plague to the planet. Now he's got I'll read you the subheading below that in just a moment. Here, he actually posted. It's hard to read from the picture, but that got a lot of people, like, it got some attention, right? And so here's what I responded with. So you can see me down there. Somebody said, so he's quoting somebody, and he's like, "What?" This person is like, "What's your contribution to society?" And he's like, "This research paper that I did." And so I said, "Like others have requested, I'd like to read it, though it's all but certain I'll be able to demonstrate why you should not have gotten an A," because he talked about getting an A. In fact, let me show you that real quick. So the subheading is, quote, "Historical ties between homophobia in communities of color and colonization," end quote. "It was for my queer studies class. That's the professor in front of me. And yes, I did get an A." All right. And so then if we go back to that image there, let's see here. Where are we? Let's go back to that. There we go. All right, so we can see him there, and that's his professor. And he's like, "Hey, white people are a plague to the planet," and whatever his article was about, which has to do with colonization, gender, colonization and gender is basically the premise of it, and he's talking about including white supremacy. So people got mad at him, and I didn't really get mad at him. I just was being kind of snarky. And look, I'm gonna be honest. I w- I was just in a mood, and I was equally being provocative. Like, he had his provocative heading. I decided to respond provocatively. And here's the funny thing about this: what I did was unnecessary, right? Like, it was not really called for, and it was, you could make an argument, say, "Liberty Dad, you're supposed to be better than that. And this is not the kind of conversation that you should." And I get you. Totally agree. Right. And I didn't do it for any other reason than I was just in a mood. So I'm not gonna pretend like I had some, like, underlying, like, I did this on purpose. I'm not gonna do that. No, it was totally just me being snarky. That's it. Um, but I did learn some interesting things from it. One, the easiest way that somebody could have disarmed me was to just ask me one simple question. What was his assignment? I don't know. I have no idea what his assignment was, right? So I don't know if his A was technically well earned, at least not by the image and not by that subheading, right? Because I don't know I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. Like, he might have written a very great paper based on the requirements that were given him. Okay. But he did post a video, which we'll get to in a moment, which kind of goes into what his paper is about. So I think the video is a separate video. So I don't think he did like a response video. Or maybe he did. I think he might have actually. But some of the comments were kind of amusing. And um, so let me pull up some of these comments here because I thought it was kind of funny, some of these comments that that people posted. So let me get this up on the screen here. So we're going to go back to my comment, my initial comment, like others requested. I'd like to read it, though it's all but certain I'll be able to demonstrate why you should have not have gotten an A. And you can see I got like 17 comments, 111 likes. Like that's crazy. Now, again, without knowing the requirements, I have no idea whether or not he should or should not have received an A. Okay. But let's take a look at some of the comments that came back. Now, he did end up blocking me, which, in fairness, like I might have done the same thing too. So I deserved it. But I did throw in here, like, hey, while I won't get to read the paper, I'll still provide commentary tomorrow on the Liberty Dad podcast. Right. So here we are. Right. And so this one was interesting. Somebody said, and your qualifications are? And I said, well, I read a lot. And then they said, so, no master degree, no professorships, not a PhD, just a guy with a Kindle. Got it. You have no qualifications to evaluate this man's work. Well, no, that's actually not true. And what's funny about it is I'm like, and your qualifications to determine my competency to evaluate any given work, like it goes both way, folks. Like if you're going to say like, what are your qualifications to evaluate this person's work? Then you need qualifications to identify whether mine, whatever they are sufficient, right? Now, I did point out, I said, if you say lack of formal pedigree, then I'm curious if you have ever disagreed with somebody with more formal education than you. I suspect you have. Virtually everyone has, which shows you only believe such a requirement when convenient. And then I said, I'll leave you with this. And I'm quoting Isaac Asimov in a paper that he wrote in 1980. It's a very interesting paper. I'll link to it. I'll link to everything in the show notes. So if I mention a source, I will link to it in the show notes. He says, I believe that every human being with a physically normal brain can learn a great deal and can be surprisingly intellectual. I believe that what we badly need is social approval of learning and social rewards for learning. We can all be members of the intellectual elite, and then and only then will a phrase like America's right to know, and indeed any true concept of democracy, have any meaning, right? Um, so then, so then let's see this person. Let's see where they go here. I thought they had some more. Okay, well, anyway, for that person, there was no more, and then some other people had some interesting things to say. Let's see. We got this one. He got the A, and there's no review that you can provide that will change that. That's true, actually, because I'm not in college. And his professor is unlikely going to read anything and then retroactively say, you know what? Turns out, based on DL's Liberty Dad's presentation on social media, on his podcast, I'm rescinding your A. Right. Like, I get it. It's not going to change. And nor would I ask it to necessarily. Again, I was just being provocative in the same way that he was being provocative. Right. And then, another person, a wise man knows nothing, knows he knows nothing. I agree, actually. A foolish man assumes everything. You've been triggered, and we can see your senseless sensitivity showing through your response. I'm like, well, quite the assumption about my response. Or do adages only work in one direction? Like you're assuming that I was triggered. And a lot of this is because there were quite a few people that were like, "Oh, dude, you're white." And I'm like, I'm actually not." And they're like, "Well, you're passing." And I'm like, "Also not." And I got into this back and forth with somebody, and I was like, they were like, I was like, more black people more black folk have thought I was black than white folk have thought I was white. I am not passing, right? Just because you disagree with my perspective on things, right? Like I don't all of a sudden like growing up, and I tell this story all the time. Growing up, I heard this all the time, and I'm not mad about it. Like no shade to any of my, if anybody's watching that knew me when I was younger, no shade. But my friends would always be like, no, 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 but seriously, what are you? And I'm like, and at the time I was like, well, I guess I'm white. I don't know. Like I thought I was white because my mom and dad were white, right? Well, turns out my biological dad is Native American, and he was rather dark. And my mom was white, and then my adopted dad was white. So like I just kind of went with it, right? I didn't really put a whole lot of thought into it. And so I heard that all the time, like, what are you? You know? And then it wasn't until I was older and I got ancestry and blah, blah, blah. So, I've learned some things since then. But my experience growing up was nobody thought I was white. Okay. Keep crying, bozo. That's a really good one. Yes. Very articulate there. I like that. Um, he explained that the paper actually isn't about white people being a plague, LMAO. So apparently you don't read enough. Well, I couldn't read the whole paper, person. So yeah, you're right. I get you. But also that's not what I wasn't triggered, right? Like I know where this is going when I saw his subheading. And then when I saw his follow-up video in response to somebody else, I was like, oh, okay. I totally get. I know for sure where he's going, and I can actually make commentary on this. Let's see. Is anything else? You are mentally ill. Here's another. Yeah, I'm mentally ill. Like that's okay. Maybe I am, but so what? Like, I'm on the internet, and is that your best response? Like, you're mentally ill? I mean, the Joker was mentally ill. It didn't mean he couldn't, cause havoc. I mean, like even mentally ill people do things, right? Good or bad. So that there's really nothing here. So what I learned from all this is that um, a lot of people aren't interested in actually having a conversation. Like people could have disarmed me at any time. They could have challenged me, and most of them really didn't. They just challenged me on things that were unrelated to what I specifically said, which was about his paper, that there was something lacking, right? They challenged my qualifications, they challenged my skin color, my mental health status. Which, by the way, I am a bit neurotic. So, like, if you want to say I'm mentally ill, like, fine, like, okay. Now that we've established that, let's go on. So let's see what else here. Let's take a look. All right, so that's the comments that I got on Twitter, and then let's see, let's look at his follow up here. So he had a follow up to somebody, and we're gonna bring this up. So he's like, I don't have the presentation, but I discussed the connections between colonization, white supremacy, and bigotry like homophobia, transphobia often. And here's an example, and then that's the video. And then let's see the comment. I have the comment that he's responding to. Yeah, so oh, yeah, that's just his follow-up to his own tweet, okay? So what I'd like to do is we're gonna start this off by watching a couple clips that I've dug up, okay? And the what I'm gonna do is I'm going to try and establish that there isn't much of a connection to colonization, white supremacy, and gender, okay? And because this is a big thing, like if you talk to people that are doing like queer studies, they're like, we got to end white supremacy because of colonization, blah blah blah, and this is a big deal. And so people will frequently refer to historical societies, ancient cultures, in part in order to establish like some sort of authority in the matter, right? So like this has always existed, and because of colonists, um, we have it way worse. And we're not where we need to be, right? And it's all, the white supremacy, which gets a little muddy, right? Because like today, like if you evaluate the term white supremacy on its face, you're like, oh, white people. And it gets a little muddy because, like they'll say things like, oh, this black person has a bad opinion about something. Well, they're the black face of white supremacy, which like literally was said, I believe, of Larry Elder. So it gets very muddy because the word at face value doesn't quite what it means. And I think that's because the word has like this rolling meaning, right? Like it changes as time goes on, and it gets adopted by people very, very quickly before the rest of society kind of gets caught up and says, oh, okay, that's what it means now, right? It's kind of like racism, right? Like racism once upon a time meant very clearly that you believed that a race could be biologically inferior or superior. Like this race just naturally has higher IQs. This one has lower IQs. This race is naturally good at karate, while this one's naturally good at basketball. Like that's what it meant. Well, now the definition has changed to something more like racism is prejudice plus power. So, like, if you have power, then you can be racist. But if you don't have power, then you can't be racist. You could just be prejudiced, I guess. Right. So, but this change occurred before most of society really adopted it. So you have this small group of people that are making changes within their own group, and then running with it as if that's what these terms mean. So the best way I think to combat this kind of stuff is to say, all right, well, let's look at the historical record. So I'm going to show you a couple of videos here. And let's see here. Where are my notes here? I'm taking a look at my notes. Okay, yeah. So what I want to do is I want to lay a foundation that, number one, I want to try to enlighten you, hopefully, and hopefully it won't be too dry. And number two, show you that, yeah, I actually have some knowledge here that I can add some value. Now I'm going to focus on, let me see, I'm looking at my notes here. Okay. So yeah, I'm sorry. I'm a little like, there's like so much information and I was trying to put it all together in the right order. And this is like, and then I was running behind today. So like kind of got me a little stressed. All right. So again, before we move on, I want you to do a couple things. One, I want you to disregard his title, "White People Are a Plague to the Planet." That was just him being provocative. Disregard that. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna say, disregard that, disregard my provocative statement. We'll call it a day. We'll call it even. Okay. We're going to focus. I want you to just think about, his subheading, historical ties between homophobia and communities of color and colonization. Now, since I couldn't read his paper, I'm going to talk about his posted video, and that's going to have to suffice, and we'll walk through that. We do know it has something to do with gender, colonization, and white supremacy based on the subheading and, of course, the video itself. Now, the approach that I'm going to take is playing some videos, and most of the material, pretty much almost all the material that I'm going to show you is old, and that is very much on purpose. I wanted to use writings and media that were prior to the significant cultural debate that we're having about gender right now. When topics are hotly debated, what ends up happening is that neutral voices become scarce because, like, you've got the extreme of one side and the extreme of other side, and it is very hard to tease out like what on either side, the information on either side, what is of value and what can we count on, right? Now, I want to give you a disclaimer very quickly. If you explicitly oppose trans folk or the notions of gender as they are being presented today, if you explicitly oppose it, then today's episode might anger you. But if you explicitly are pro trans in the gender conversation from the trans community, then the wider trans community, then today's episode might also anger you. Okay. So I'm probably going to make some people on both sides mad, and that's okay. Because again, what we're trying to do is just establish some information and get an understanding of what what were these cultures like? Okay. And does the historical record match this idea of colonization? Good morning, Mr. Producer. Does the historical record match the the idea that there's an issue with colonization that needs to be dealt with in white supremacy in order for these notions of gender to flourish, for people to flourish? And I say it's not. So I'm going to show you two different videos here. They're stitched from three technically. So one's a video of its own, and then the second one is like two stitched videos. So the first one is going to be and I hope I say all these terms correctly, the Bugis from Indonesia, from I think it's their second largest island of Sulawesi, and then the Mushe from Mexico. Now, the Mushe video, since the clips are in Spanish, I will have the audio a little bit lower, and then I'll just read the subtitles for anybody that's listening so that you don't miss out, because it's literally all in Spanish, right? And these are like documentaries where and these are people that are talking that live in these communities. Okay. So let's play that first clip. This is the Bugis. And this is from Indonesia. Okay. And this is like a 16-year-old video from National Geographic. So this is like a very old video. Okay. But this again is before the conversation of gender got so hot and debated. All right. So let's play this.
In many cultures, a person existing outside the two accepted genders is seen as confronting, even threatening. But gender is defined by culture. And on South Sulawesi, the Bugis believe that in addition to men, women, and Bisu, there are two more. These two additional genders are made up of people who in the West would be considered transvestites. Tambu's gender is Chalalai. Biologically, she's female, but she lives as a man.
I feel comfortable as Chalalai. My family is also comfortable. As long as I'm a good person and I work hard, people accept me.
Abdul Rahman, or Poppy, is Chalabai. He has male genitalia, but has lived as a woman since he was 6 years old.
I'm not special. The Bugis culture accepts all 5 genders.
Tambu and Poppy join the fertility ceremony. Because, according to High Priest Puang Matoa, all 5 genders must coexist for there to be universal harmony.
There are 5 genders, and we don't need to separate people based on their gender because everything must live in harmony. If one of the genders is separated, then the world would become unbalanced.
At a sacred cave 3 miles from Sageri, the Bisu begin the first stage of the blessing, an offering to the earth. The Bugis believe the universe has 3 levels. Heaven, where Pa-Tote lives, the middle world, where humans live, and the underworld, where the spirits live.
We pray that everything, animals, plants, people, everything, stays connected with each other, not only from this village or the district, but the whole country. The whole world is kept in balance and safe.
The second stage of the blessing is an offering to the spirits. Because of their Bisu gender, the Bugis believe that Bisu priests can communicate with them. Puang Matoa must be possessed by a spirit from the underworld before the fertility ritual can be completed.
In order for Bisu to be able to bestow particular blessings, they have to be able to contact the spirit world. And part of the reason they can contact the spirit world is because they are male and female embodiments. And then the Bisu, with all of those combinations of female, male, spiritual powers, can bestow a very strong blessing.
Okay, so what's our takeaway from this video? I'm trying to compact the videos as much as I can. So that one was the whole video. The next one is actually going to be, it's actually comprised of 2 videos that are 12 and 9 minutes long, but I actually cut it down to like 3 or 4 or something like that. So I'm doing my best to give you enough context to make my point, but without like literally playing a long documentary or anything like that. But again, you can go and watch all of these videos. Everything's going to be in there. So the takeaway from this video here is that you've got this group of people in Indonesia, and they have particular beliefs about gender that are strongly tied to religious views. And I thought the most important element of what they said was that their idea of gender demands effectively, I mean, they didn't quite say it like that, but it effectively demands that everybody live in harmony. Okay. So like part of the acceptance is that we have to, because of our spiritual and religious beliefs, we have to figure out how everybody can coexist. And so they do. All right. So now let's go back over to but let's fly over, if you will, to Mexico, and we're gonna watch a couple clips here. You know, a little clip here about the Mushe, which is a similar. It's only like a 3rd gender. So in Indonesia, there's a group of people that believe there are like 5 genders. Over here in Mexico, they believe that there are 3. So let's watch that clip. And then we're going to get into the juicy stuff where we start talking about this man's video and these ideas of colonization. But I just wanted to lay this foundation for you to understand where I'm coming from and why I'm saying the things that I'm saying about this. So let's take a look here. All right. So I'm going to read this, by the way, because again, remember, it's in Spanish. All right. The story starts when I was about 4 or 5 years old. And give me a second here, Anna. My father used to be a fisherman and he didn't really get this. He didn't get if I was a he or a she. I'm in the way here. From 7 in the morning until 2 in the evening, I was free. I could do anything I wanted. And this is the Muche. All right. So putting on the clothes. Since I liked to dance, one day I was invited to a party and I dressed up like a woman. Somebody took a photo, and the next day the photo arrived at my house. Like, talk about outing somebody, right? Like, not very nice. My mother received the picture. I came back from work, and my mother asked me, "Who is this girl?" And she told me I was in big trouble if my father ever saw that picture. All right. And I want you to keep that in mind, right? Then we'll continue on here. I like my Muche because he helps. This is a very interesting part right here. He helps a lot. He works, washes dishes, he cooks, he prepares atole. He does everything. Since he was little, 2 years old, I knew she was Muche because his birth was not painful. I was supposed to have a boy's birth pain, not a girl's birth pain. So that's the mom there talking about her son. A boy's birth pain is stronger, bigger pain. Okay. So this is a young boy. Now, keep in mind, it just flashed up on the screen really quickly. It said 2001. So this is at least from 2001. The actual video may have come earlier before they cut it up and put it out. When I was a kid, I wanted to live like a Muche. So here's this little kid in Mexico. My name is Carolina and Elvis. I want people to call me Carolina. I like to use makeup for my lips and my eyes. I want to be a Muche. Sorry about the pauses, folks. My oldest brother scolds me and he hides my clothes so I don't wear them. He doesn't like to see me wearing women's clothes. My sister likes it. Sometimes I borrow clothes from her. He wears a skirt from a friend of mine, a blouse and makeup as well. He even wore a bra. Honestly, I wanted him to be a man. But he was born like this. It is something from birth. As soon as he started walking, we knew he was like that. It doesn't bother me. He is my son. I accept him the way he is. I thank God because I didn't have any girls. Well, only one. But with him, I have two. All right. So this is the second video. All right. We're almost done here. In Yucatan, as Muxes, we are considered a third gender. Even though we take on a feminine role, we have our own Muxe identity, which is what defines us. There are some men, women, and Muxe. We don't really want to get in the spot of a woman because women are women and men are men. And Muxe, well, they are Muxe. We just work so that our Muxe rights are respected. All right. So that's the videos that I wanted to show you really quickly before we get into this. So the takeaway here is I want you to notice what these folk were actually talking about. So these are from a city in Mexico that by all appearances, doesn't have a lot of U.S. influence. Okay. And so they may have some colonization influence from years past, but they largely seem to be about who they were from many, many years ago. Okay. And same thing with the Boogies, but we'll find out a little bit more here in just a moment about the Boogies as we go through some more information. So the takeaway from these videos, number one, notice that there are perceptions about either the Busi, which is in Indonesia, or the Mushe that are in Mexico. Like there's these social perceptions about them. Like men are men, women are women, and Mushe, well, they're just Mushe. That's what they said, right? And they're like, and the one Mushe was like, or no, I'm sorry, the one person from the Indonesia video, she was like, look, I'm not special. I'm just who I am. Right. So the attitude of who they are and how they fit into society is entirely different than the one that we have in the US. Right. We don't get the impression that there are teachers, that would say, okay, if your parents don't accept you, come to me, like the libs of TikTok videos that we see too often. Like there's just like too many of them, right? And don't get me wrong, I've said before that libs of TikTok videos don't necessarily tell you the whole story. Little side point there. What they do is that you watch enough videos and you start getting the impression that that it's all over the place. And that's because you're watching too many videos and that becomes your reality because like this is what you see on a regular basis. You watch three libs of TikTok videos every single day and for like a week and you've seen 21 videos and you're like, man, there's teachers everywhere. I don't want to send my kid to any school, right? And the reality is that there's like 300 million people in the United States, more than that. And there are quite a few people, and it's not clear that all of them are necessarily actually teachers. There's just a lot of people that get online and make videos of all sorts. But when that's your fill, then that becomes your reality, right? But we don't get the sense from these videos that this sort of behavior, this sort of attitude exists, right? They're not demanding and saying, you will use my preferred pronouns. They don't have DEI implemented on their behalf, in any way, shape, or form. Their culture has kind of accepted there are males and there are females, and as we'll see in a few moments here, there are very specific roles for which you can and cannot partake in, right? So even though that these societies are not fixed to the binary gender idea, that doesn't mean that they don't have specific norms for those genders. They do, and they have specific ideas about them. And I think this is where it becomes problematic by saying, well, we got these problems with white supremacy and colonization. Okay, so let's get to this guy's clip. I think we've played enough of that stuff. We kind of got an idea, a little bit of a foundation here, and we're gonna play and go through and just kind of see what we can find from his clip, and if I can, if I can salvage my Twitter reputation for shooting my mouth off, like, was I correct in saying that this man shouldn't have gotten an A without even reading it? Like, could I even come close to making that kind of a statement credibly? So let's take, or more importantly, like other people asked, do I have the creds, if you will, to be able to talk about this topic? Or should I just shut up and listen to somebody who's in college and has done a little bit of research and apparently, based on his one research paper, knows more than me, right? Like I couldn't do research paper equally as him, right? Like him and I are on the same footing, effectively, right? But other people don't see it that way. They're just like, oh, he did a college paper and he got an A from his professor. Like, okay, but does everybody that gets an A, do you think that everybody that got an A deserved it? Like, no, you don't. So again, we're back to that. It's very, very selective. All right, so let's watch his video here real quick. Okay, let me try to do this again. How about we do it this way? I didn't get the. Let me fix the audio real quick. I'll fix that audio. I made a mistake there. Okay, let's go back. There we go.
These different forms of hate and white supremacy, and how perpetuating these forms of hate against the group of people impacted by these forms of hate perpetuates white supremacy.
Okay, so I think he cut into a video or something. I'm not exactly clear what he's talking about at the very beginning. Is because it just sounds like a jumbled mess of words. But this is just a simple video, so we're not going to make a big issue of that. I'm just unclear, but we can see by the image that he has. That he's got this umbrella with white supremacy, and he's got misogyny, fat phobia, transphobia, racism, ableism, classism, xenophobia, homophobia. It's like all these things fall under white supremacy. So the big question that we have, again, if we're taking words at their face value, is is this something that is perpetuated by colonists who were white? Okay, because you can kind of make the argument and say, well, today, DL, um, today, whiteness has all these problems and you've got these privileges, so you can make that argument. But again, he's making an argument about colonization and the historical records. It's a little different because times were different then, right? You can't just say like everything all the whiteness that we see today that we don't like completely existed 500 years ago, because societies were not even nearly as mixed as they are today, right? They didn't have nearly the interaction. So you can't simply say that, right? Like there was a time when some countries, some white countries had barely saw black people, right? So you can't say that in those times they had this white supremacy that they have today, when there's a lot of mixture of people. Like it doesn't make sense. It doesn't follow in any sense of the word. So let's continue on and play a little bit more here. One more side note I want to point out. If you know who Karlin Borshenko is, I think she actually talks about some subtext to all this language. That's not the scope of this podcast, right? Like today, I'm talking about the face value of everything, right? So if white supremacy actually means capitalism, actually, like that's for another conversation. Go seek out her. She's got a lot of information regarding that. We're just talking about the face value, because I believe if you can address the face value, then you can basically undercut some of these arguments that I think are no good. So let's continue on.
Today, we'll be talking about transphobia. Don't you fucking scroll. This is important. If you want to know how to combat these things, you have to know what they're rooted in, period.
Okay, so he's talking about like, hey, it's rooted, right? These things are rooted. And so therefore, therefore he's making the argument that it's historical. Like there's a root that we can address. So let's continue.
Be it two-spirited people who have many different names in many different indigenous American cultures, be it third gender people who have existed in India for centuries, be it the Chabados of Angola, child. Trans people have always existed. Trans people have always existed. That is the important message to get here, right?
Okay, he's actually not quite accurate here. What has always existed were cultures that differed from the binary gender of male and female, as we saw in the videos. But they did not exist necessarily in the same form as we see today. I'm sorry? Give me a few minutes, champ. They didn't exist always in that form, right? And they didn't look like, they didn't talk about themselves in the way that we have today. We didn't have this like, you need to be affirmed. Like we saw some people like, hey, your dad's going to be upset if you your dad's going to be upset if he sees this photo, right? Like there existed where people had objections about things and they had perceptions about things, right? It wasn't a free for all that we kind of see today. So it's not quite exactly accurate. And I believe that one video suggested that that they were more akin to like transvestites, those in the Indonesian culture, right? And it was uniquely tied to religious views, which is also not the same today. Like people just like, oh, I was just born this way, like that's how I am, right? And the other thing that you'll notice is that there's not a lot of attempts to surgically modify or take hormones or deal with dysphoria, right? Like people existed and they were like, okay, I'll wear a dress, I'll do these things, but otherwise, this is who I am. This is what I have to work with. right? So we have an entirely different society today, so we can't just say, oh, well, the transgender people have always existed. What we can say is that variations of gender have existed from binary to tertiary to even more, like five, possibly even more, depending on the culture that you're looking at. All right, so let's continue.
Hey, don't you fucking scroll. We get into the good part. One of the articles that I'm referencing heavily in this video talks about a trans woman named Victoria who was arrested in 1556 by colonizers because they viewed her gender expression as a threat. I'm going to link this article in my link tree, by the way, if you want to go check it out, because it's a good read. I want to be clear. I'm starting at colonization because colonization is at the root of white supremacy. That is what inspired the social construct of race to begin with, because othering people is a necessary tool and was a necessary tool in justifying why colonization and conquest happened for indigenous peoples and Black and brown peoples across the globe.
Okay. So he's actually, again, not accurate. A lot of the colonization was simply people were seeking to go out and find new lands and then basically take them over. And this happened largely, a lot of your colonists were white, but you had some others that the conquistadors that you would arguably say are not white. And the colonization happened all over the world, but it played out in different ways. So for instance, he mentions, and I can't remember the name of them now, but those in India. And in India, the British, when they came over, they saw that there were third genders, and they actually didn't like it, and they sought to put out rules and impose limitations on that, right? But then you've got like the Dutch in Indonesia. The Dutch, when they colonized Indonesia, they largely, at least as far as I can tell, they left it alone. And as we'll see in just a moment, there's an article that points out like the Bugis have existed for like over 600 years. And it wasn't until like the last roughly 60 or so that they started having problems. And so they didn't actually have problems that stemmed during the colonization period. And then you've got the Oaxaca and Yucatan areas where here in Mexico, or not here in Mexico, but in Mexico, where they also had some perceptions about gender, but they don't appear to have the influence from the white man, if you will. So again, the face value of white supremacy and colonization it comes across as pretty inaccurate, because you had different cultures that were doing different things, and different things played out in different way. Like the situation played out differently for people. Now, I'm going to skip over. I'm not really going to talk about this one particular anecdote that he's talking about here, because what I want to do is I actually want to talk about the article that he cites, and he said he cites heavily from it. So I actually have that article pulled up, and we're going to take a look at it. We're going to see what it is that we can discern from that. So let me pull that up really quickly, and right there. Okay. So this article, it says, let me put it up on my screen. So the deviant African genders that colonialism condemned, right? European travelers and anthropologists found that their gendered worldview didn't easily map onto the societies that they encountered. That is true. Okay. The problem is how we talk about some of these cultures today. I think we minimize the reality for which they lived in. So let's go down here a little bit. And I've got it highlighted here, but I'll read. In pre-colonial times, wrote the late feminist scholar Nyara Sudarska, women in West Africa were conspicuous in high places. They led armies, often played important consultative roles in politics, and in the case of the Levedu people, I'm doing my best here, folks, present-day South Africa, they were even supreme reign queens. What it meant to be a woman in many African pre-colonial societies was not rigid. Among the Langai of North Uganda, writes Sylvia Tamale, dean of the faculty of law at Makerere University, Uganda, the quote, Mudoku Daku, or effeminate males, were treated as women and could marry men. There were also the Chibados, as he mentions, and the Kimbanda of Angola, male diviners, whom scholars have argued were believed to carry female spirits through anal sex. So we're kind of getting this perception here. And what I really want to focus on is this Mudoko Dako or effeminate males were treated as women and could marry men. It's like that's all it says. And it sounds like this people were like, hey, you're an effeminate male. What's such? We'll just treat you like a woman. No big deal. It's cool. And it wasn't until the colonizers came that things all went, to hell, right? Well, that's actually not quite so true. So everybody that talks about this particular group of people, the effeminate males, the Mudoku Dako, they reference a 1923 book. And that 1923 book is titled The Lango, a Nilotic Tribe of Uganda. And the man that wrote it, he wrote it in like 1923. It's a 500-page book, and it's out of print. So you might be like, oh, well, DL, how would you know? Well, thank you, Library of Congress, because now we can learn a little bit more about what the author that everybody cites actually said about this group of people. And so we can start to get an idea of what these people were like before before colonists really came in and imposed all their terrible ideas about two genders. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at that, and I'm going to put that up on the screen here. So we'll finish this, and let's see here. Is that the one we want? Yes. So there we go. Did that get it? There we go. Okay, perfect. So let me read you. So this is from this is like page 210 in the book, because I was able to again pull it from the Library of Congress and read through it and find out what he said in more context, right? So here is what he said. This is under this section. So he's talking about the social order. And under this section called sexual aberrations, contrary to the order of nature, the offender is put to death. Sounds pretty serious. And then it goes on to say if the offense is committed with an animal, and then the next part, both man and animal are killed, and the animal which is replaced by the offender's relations is burnt to ashes. Its flesh may not be eaten. In this, in this and the previous offense, both of which are extremely rare, and in the known instances have been committed by men of weak intellect, the presumption is that only an exponent of witchcraft would act in this manner, and consequently the offender is an enemy of society. And then you see a little 2 there for a footnote. Okay, so this is where we start talking about this group of people, these effeminate males. So let's look at the footnote and see what this the author says about these people. So he says, an exception is made in the case of a small class of men known as Joe Appel, referred to also as Joe Aboik or the impotents. These men, being impotent from birth, are considered as the afflicted of God. They acknowledge a mortal father, but believe that a divine agency operated at their fertilization. Okay, being impotent, they have all the instincts and nature of women, and as such are recognized by men and women alike. They accordingly become women. A man who has been transformed, who has been who becomes a woman, and they have the name there. They wear the characteristic facial and bodily ornaments of a woman, the chip, the dell, and the lao. So the things that the women would wear. They wear their long hair, dressing in ringlets like women's hair, and take women's names. They do all women's work. So it's very interesting, right? Weed, sweep the house and courtyard, cook the food, fetch fuel and water. They observe women's clan, I think it's taboos, and like women are debarred from owning property or from following men's pursuits, such as hunting. They even simulate menstruation and wear the leaves prescribed for women in their courses. They appear in all other respects to be mentally sound and are most industrious. Being women, therefore, in all except the physical characteristics, they are treated as such and live with the man as his wife without offending against Lango law. Sometimes, but rarely, property is passed on via marriage, and their co-wives welcome him as a woman. The total number of such persons does not amount to 50, but among the Etso and current, whatever, I can't even say those tribes, such people of hermaphroditic instincts are very numerous. Okay, so what are we saying here? What does all of this reading mean? What I'm telling you is that when you go back in the historical record, you see that yes, there were people of varying genders, and they had very specific roles that were that they were not negotiable. We didn't have this idea of you will call me this. It was the society that said you will do this and be treated like this. So I hope you're seeing the picture that I'm painting here, because the picture is it wasn't necessarily all rosy before the colonists showed up. Because even though the colonists may have come and said, "Hey, we have a view that there's only two genders, and you're going to fit into one of these roles," they already existed in a society just like that, but with more genders. They simply existed in maybe 5 genders or 3 genders, whatever the culture had determined. And when you fit into one of those, it wasn't always pleasant. Some people still didn't like you, right? Like the men may sneer down and look poorly upon you. Or, as we saw with the Lango tribe, that's heavily cited in the article that he presented. We see that that they weren't allowed to own property, that that there's certain considerations for, but they did all the women's work. Well, transgender folk, you don't see men who are transgender, biological men who are transgender and determine that they are a woman, and then come around and say, I'm going to do the things that society thinks of as a woman. Instead, they tend to do exaggerated stuff, which has been a complaint of many, many people, right? So one complaint that people have is that, like, hey, these are caricatures of women. These aren't actual women. But you'll notice in the video that I showed earlier from the Mouche, they actually dressed a little bit more like the typical woman would dress, right? They weren't exaggerative. They weren't hyperbolic versions of them. They weren't the drag versions per se, right? And this is the point that I think that is missed when people start talking about colonization and gender and white supremacy, is that they're narrowing their focus on, I think honestly, they're actually being influenced by the society they live in to determine, to make their assessments about these older societies, right? Because they're like, well, today people argue whether there are more than two genders, but back then they didn't. You're right. They did not in some cases, right? Some cultures certainly did, but in some cultures they did not. But they also did not argue that that genders had specific roles, right? And we could see, like, the one woman, she was like, "Look, I'm glad that my child is a Mouche because he can help do some of the work," right? So some of the poorer people, they enjoy, the women at least would enjoy having a son that was not masculine, because that meant they didn't have to do all the work. They could pawn off some of the work on their son, who would normally not have to do it because he was the male and he fit the masculine role. So even in these societies, while they may have opened the door for more gender, more than two genders, they still predominantly based their lives on two genders, right? Like that's the key component that's missing. And we see this in multiple societies across history, across the planet. You've got Mexico, Indonesia, and if you look up and you read about those in India, is a very similar situation, right? Until the British came and colonized and said, hey, we don't really like this, right? So we see these kind of things consistently. All right. Let's see. Let's get back to this video here real quick, and let's see if we can't wrap this up.
You can see here, a lot of Christians and Europeans view people who they deem to be male, who expressed in themselves differently, to be a threat, and they would use that, to be honest, as fuel to validate why they did what they did.
So I actually don't disagree here. Like we do have the historical record that when Christians, and it's not just Christians, good sir, it's other cultures as well, they did the very same thing. We'll see in just a moment that Islam did a similar thing. So yes, people justify things all sorts of ways. Like, that is not a new concept. That has happened since time immemorial, right? Like that's not something unique to Christians or colonists or white people, right? Like, this is something that you find in virtually every single culture. I mean, I just sat here and pointed out that this one woman, which is common, like other videos express this same sentiment. This one woman was like, look, I'm glad that my son's a Mushe because I get to have some help now. So like she's justifying, her good treatment of him. Like, oh, he's a Mushe. She didn't say he's a Mushe. I guess that's how he was born. And who am I to argue with nature? And I should just accept him and affirm his identity. No, she was like, oh, you're Mushe? Dishes. Right? Like, so people justify things in all sorts of ways, and he's cherry picking the justification in some negative stuff. And I don't doubt the story that he's telling here, like a woman was singled out. Like, I'm sure that happened. I don't disagree. But what we want to do is we want to get in a perspective of the wider conversation about gender and about cultures over time. And what do they mean? And does it really reflect a serious problem with colonization that needs to be addressed today? And I say the answer is no, because a lot of the same components existed prior to colonization. A lot of these things existed. The idea of two genders was pretty predominant, even if they allowed for multiple genders. So even then, like the top of the cherry picking order were male and female. It wasn't, and it was actually male. So it'd be like male, female, and then what have you, right? Because the males could own property, they got to go hunting, they didn't have to do some of the housework stuff. Like these things existed, and if somebody wants to make an argument that colonists ruined it all, which is effectively the argument that they're making, then what they need to do is they need to show how a society existed prior to the colonization and say, here's the record that we have of this society, a society existing in this particular manner. Then the colonists showed up, and then things all went to heck. And now we do see that with the British and India, right? Like we do have evidence for that, but then we also have counter evidence where things didn't really change for others. So let me, and that's really all of the video. I mean, there's like a little bit more that we could get into, but I'm running short of time because there's just too much information. So I'm going to cut it short, but I'll link to his video. You could watch it and see if I really missed anything and there was some context that I should have added and I didn't. But I'm trying to respect your time because we're coming up close to the hour here. So I want to go back to a news article here. And so this is actually pretty interesting. And before I do that, let me read to you from a paper a little bit. And so this paper is called, it's a 2002 paper called Sexualities and Gender in Zapotica. It is Zapotic, Oaxaca. All right, it's in Mexico. All right, I'm sure I'm saying those names wrong, but that's okay. So I want to read you because I want to kind of reaffirm again that when we look at information prior to the raging debate, we see that there were stereotypes and kind of like required roles in a sense. So let me cut over to this and we'll read this really quickly. Then we'll look at a news article real quick to talk about the Indonesian people and then we'll close. Okay. So here's what it says. I begin by presenting ethnographic It's a 19-page paper. I'm only doing a couple snippets. I begin by presenting ethnographic snapshots of gender and sexuality in two different sites in contemporary Oaxaca that will provide a sense of the uniqueness of each place and a great variety found within this relatively small geographic area. Some of the key elements that emerge from these snapshots are a third gender role for biologically sexed men in Zapotic communities. Okay, so no disagreement. We do have these additional genders. They do exist. Not arguing that point. So we move on. Yucatec men are also demonstrate an interesting variety of gender relations and sexualities. While most are either married or dating and not or dating and not yet married, a small number of men assume the role of Mushe. Chinas defines Mushe as, quote, persons who appear to be predominantly male but display certain female characteristics and fill a third gender role between men and women, taking some of the characteristics of each. Mushe are perceived as different from other men. Some marry women and have children. Others form long-term partnerships with men. A distinguishing characteristic of many Mushe is that they may do certain kinds of women's work, such as embroidery or decorating home altars, but others do the male work of making jewelry. Many now have white-collar jobs and are involved in politics. So at this point, it's a little different than we saw with the Lango tribe, where like, hey, you did women's roles over here. They're like, okay, well, you can do some women's roles, and then you can also do some men's roles. Like, that's cool. Like, we've got some differences here, right? Continuing on, Mushe men are not referred to as homosexuals, but constitute a separate category based on gender attributes. People perceive them as having the physical bodies of men, but different aesthetic, work, and social skills from most men, right? So you're not the same. Like, the society already looks at you differently. Like, oh, you're Mushe. You're different. You don't have the work and social skills of men, right? Like, that's not transgender. That's not how the transgender community looks at things here in the US, right? They may have some attributes of women or combine those of men and women. While Mushe do not exhibit all the characteristics associated with masculinity, here's the important part: neither do they necessarily reject them. In the US, there's a heavy component of rejecting masculinity and calling critique on it. And that does come from the transgender community. But we don't see that in these historical societies. They're uniquely different. But people today want to go and write papers and then just be like, well, this culture over here proves that there was additional genders. Okay, yes, they do. But the genders had roles and they had specific perceptions about those roles. You can't escape that. And some of those started with a binary model for gender. They said, oh, you're not a man, you're different. You're not a woman, you're different. But these cultures they leaned a little bit more toward you can be a woman, right? Rather than you can just be this unique type of man. All right, last part of that article there. Mushe are differently evaluated by men and women because they may not meet all of the norms of Zapodic masculinity. So, like they're saying, like, we have masculine norms. They exist, right? And what you have the transgender community doing, largely, a lot of the activists today here in the US, they're trying to tear down the masculinity norms that we have. That didn't happen in these other societies. They respected the norms. They respected the basis for gender, which was male and female. They respected it. We see this repeatedly. Okay. Exhibiting physical strength in rural labor, socializing with men, maintaining a public face of authority in their homes and on the street. Right. So, like, they just assumed, like, hey, you're Mushe. Well, then you don't have the physical strength. You can't work like other men. You can't socialize like other men. You can't be like authoritative like another man, right? Like, they really limited people in this society. They may be disparaged by men because they are a constant reminder of the constructedness of masculinity. Heterosexuality does not seem to be a dominant part of the masculine image. Okay. So these societies had an entirely different makeup. Now, I want to look at one last thing here. And then we're going to close the show because my producer is hungry and you don't keep your producer waiting, right? Like, that's just a bad idea. You get in, much trouble for that. So this is an article titled, and let me pull it up on the screen for you so that you can see it as well. So this is a article titled Homophobia and Rising Islamic Intolerance Push Indonesia's Intersex Bisu Priest to the Brink, right? And this is titled 2019. So it's the most recent article that I'm really calling upon. So we scroll down here. Once kingmakers in one of the most gender fluid societies on earth, okay, one of the most, the intersex Bisu priest of Sulawesi, Indonesia's third largest island, are on the verge of disappearing after years of cultural decline and increasing persecution. It is a cultural tradition that has persisted for centuries in a Muslim majority country, but the tradition of revering priests who were born intersex with male and female characteristics, known as Bisu, is dying out. Locals and anthropologists have warned. Okay. So if we look over here at the key points, because we don't want to read the whole article, and everything will be linked. You can go check it out and see if I really just butchered it all. Key points. The Boogies have 5 genders. We established that in the video earlier: cis men and women, transgender men and women, and the intersex Bisu. The tradition dates back at least 600 years, according to anthropologists. Now, Indonesia was colonized by the Dutch. And then in like 1947, I think, I think it was in 1947, they actually got their independence. I might be wrong on the date on that, but somewhere around there. So they got their independence after 3 years of being kind of ruled by the Japanese. They actually declared their independence. They weren't colonized until they were colonized many years ago, but after this 600-year mark. Okay. And then there was a lot of Islamic influence. And it wasn't until 600 years later that we see here in that third bullet point, a recent rise in hardline Islamism and homophobia has coincided with a dramatic decline in Bisu numbers. So this is actually only very recent. So even though they were colonized, they were doing, I don't want to say they were doing fine, but the Bisu, the Bugis, the people that had this 5 genders, they existed for like 600 years and were in some ways, you might call it flourishing. But then in the last, like, I don't know, 50, 60 years ish, somewhere, I think it says 60 years in here somewhere. We used to have around 40 Bisu a few years ago. Now there are only 5 left taking care of all their complex roles in society, she told ABC, cultural officer employed in the local government, right? And this is in South Sulawesi, right? So the point here is that you can't blame everything on colonization because the historical record doesn't support it. It just, when you read and you go look at some of this information, from the 1920s on, you see that people had a different perspective, right? We're not running with the perspective that we want to see here in the US and applying it retroactively to these cultures. What we look and we see, like, okay, they recognized 2 genders and their societies were generally built around 2 genders. And if they deviated from the 2 gender model, they did so as an acceptance, with the exception of, it looks like the Bugis people who said, like, all 5 got to live in harmony, right? So let me ask you about that. Like, do you see people, the trans community, largely, and I'm talking about the activists, not just every single trans person ever, but mostly the activists, do you see them attempting to live in harmony with the other people? Now you might say, well, DL, it's the Republicans and these, but hold on. Think about this for a moment. Both sides are warring, right? And when we see things from the activist, they're not necessarily pointing out, like, hey, this is how I would like to live in this society, and these are the norms that I'm willing to accept if you'll just accept me. No, they're saying we should get rid of all of these norms. None of them are any good. They're all terrible. Masculinity is horrible. Colonist this, white supremacist this, Islamophobia, transphobia, all those words that he had on his screen underneath the umbrella. We're seeing, like, all this attitudes that didn't exist in these other cultures. But then they want to rely on these other cultures and say, well, these other cultures prove our point. No, they prove that you're being fools, right? And that you're not trying to exist, as is often said, in society. You're trying to dominate society. In effect, you can look at that as being internal colonist. Like, you're trying to take over society and say, this is how society will be shaped. It's going to be according to our views. So, and if you don't agree to this, if you don't capitulate, you're the bad person. But that's not what we saw in the society. We saw something entirely different. Now again, they did confirm them. They confirmed that, like, hey, yeah, different cultures had multiple genders. But again, one more time, for those in the back, they existed on the concept that there were primarily 2 genders in most cases. And the model of 2 genders was the driving factor. Everything else beyond that was an anomaly, right? It was considered like, this is out of the ordinary. So it was entirely different. So this is why I say, like, hey, he should not have received an A. And it wasn't because I was just being mean. It's because I understand already where he's coming from, because I've seen these arguments before. They are not new, right? And I think that one of the things that we need to do, we need to study and read and understand the historical record, so that when people start making these kind of claims, we can say, no, I think you're missing out a lot of context. And it is in some ways it is the same. In other ways, it's not. In other ways, you are being the bad actor. If we compare you to the same people that you say proved your point, right? And then if you want to say colonization messed it all up, okay, then let's go back and look at prior to colonization. What did we see? We saw people that accepted the social norms. They didn't try to reject masculinity or femininity for that matter. They didn't try to demand you're going to talk to me in this particular way. And if you don't, then maybe I'll commit suicide, or maybe you hate children, or all these other things that people emotionally try to manipulate you with. That didn't happen. And so the reason that you might be able to argue and say things were different pre-colonial is because they fit into the social norms. It didn't spend their days challenging them left and right. And that's not what's happening today. People are not trying to live in harmony. And I would argue that today what we're seeing is a hellscape and to some degree internal colonization, because you have a small group of people that are really trying to dominate the larger culture. But that's not what they did back in the day. Now, that's what the conquistadors did. That's what the British did, and so on and so forth, the Dutch and whatever. Like they did. They went and they said, all right, this is our land now. We're taking over. And you people will abide by our rules, right? Like that's what happened. But today, I think it's a little bit more devious looking. So anyway, that's my show for today. Okay, that was a lot. And this producer's hungry, and he's getting a little impatient with me. So let me skim through some comments here and just see. Looks like let's see. I'm a trans morning person. Okay, I'm not sure what that means, but it sounds kind of amusing. That's kind of funny. Let's see here. Let's see what else we got here. Let's see. Okay. It looks like the conversation mostly is between people in the comment section. So, thank you everybody for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it informative and inspiring. When you go out and you're engaging with people, maybe be a little less provocative than I was. Ultimately we want to try to treat people in a positive way so that they'll want to have a conversation with us tomorrow. Clearly I did not do that. I started out very provocative and I got blocked by the guys. So now I'll probably never get a second chance, and it's my own doing, for which I admit. But what we want to do is we generally want to just be educated, and then we want to treat people the best that we can and speak as informed as we can. So be sure to catch me weekdays, Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. Eastern-ish. I try to be on time, but it's tough sometimes. For an informed discussion on politics and culture. And then again on Sunday nights at 7 p.m. with my co-host, Susan Hogarth, where we discuss LP happenings. We look across the vast vast landscape of tyranny here in the United States, and then we bring to you what the Libertarian Party is doing so that you can be inspired by the things that are happening and be inspired to do some of those things in your own neighborhood. Be sure you are subscribed to my YouTube channel, or if you prefer my Rumble channel, you can go to youtube.libertydad.com, or you can go to rumble.libertydad.com. While you're there and subscribing, please let me know how I'm doing by dropping me a comment in the comment section. And lastly, I want you to remember, if you are a champion of liberty, your business is people and your product is liberty. I want you to have a great week. Catch you next time, but I'm out.